I wanted to discuss two general types of neural circuits that dopamine tends to enhance. So let's talk neural circuits. And for those of you that love hearing neuroscience nomenclature, you're going to eat this part up. And for those of you that don't like a lot of names of brain areas, I invite you to tune out or just try and grab the top contour of this. I will describe it in pretty general terms, but I will give some detail because I know there are some of you out there who really want to dig deeper into what the exact structures and connectivities are. Okay? So there are two main types of circuits that we need to think about with respect to ADHD, attention, and dopamine. The first one is called the default mode network. The default mode network is the network of brain areas in your brain, in my brain, and in everybody's brain that is active when we're not doing anything, when we're just sitting there idle at rest. Now, it's very hard to not think about anything, but when you're not engaged in any type of specific task, so you're not driving, you're not playing a video game, you're not trying to study, you're not trying to listen, you're just sitting there letting your brain kind of go wherever it wants to go, your default mode network underlies that state of mind. The other set of circuits that we're going to think about and talk about with respect to ADHD are the task networks, the networks of the brain that make you goal-oriented or that are at least trying to make you goal-oriented. And those are a completely different set of brain areas. However, the default mode network and these task networks are communicating with one another, and they're doing that in very interesting ways. So first I want to describe how these two sets of brain areas, the default mode network and the task networks, normally interact. Okay? So a little bit of naming here. Again, feel free to ignore it if you don't want this level of detail, but the default mode network includes an area called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Frontal cortex, no surprise, is in the front, and you have a dorsal, the top, and side, lateral part, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. You got one on each side of your brain, right? And then you have a brain area called the posterior cingulate cortex. And then you have an area called the lateral parietal lobe. Again, you don't need to remember these names, but these are three brain areas that normally are synchronized in their activity. So when one of these areas is active in a typical person, the other areas would be active as well. So it's a little bit like a symphony or a band, like a three-piece band. It's like drums, guitar, and bass. They're playing together, okay? That's how it is in a typical person. In a person with ADHD, or even a person who has subclinical ADHD, or in any human being who hasn't slept well, what you find is the default mode network is not synchronized. These brain areas are just not playing well together. Now, the task networks include a different set of structures. It still involves the prefrontal cortex, but it's a different part of the prefrontal cortex. Okay, tends to be the medial prefrontal cortex. And there are some other brain areas that the medial prefrontal cortex is communicating to all the time, mainly to suppress impulses. It's shutting down the desire to stand up or to scratch the side of your cheek or your nose if you're trying not to do that. Anytime you're restricting your behavior, these task-directed networks are very active. Okay? Now, normally, in a person without ADHD, the task networks and the default mode networks are going in kind of seesaw fashion. They are actually what we call anti-correlated. So it's not just that they are not correlated, they are actually opposing one another. They are anti-correlated. In a person with ADHD, the default mode networks and the task networks are actually more coordinated. That might come as surprising. I think that we all have this tendency to kind of jump to conclusion and assume that somebody who doesn't have an easy time paying attention or has ADHD, that their brain must be completely incoherent, that it's not working well and because everything's out of whack. But there's something interesting about people with ADHD whereby the task networks and the default mode networks are actually working together in a way that's correlated, and that is what's abnormal. So this would be like the guitar, bass, and the drums playing together in a way where the bass isn't keeping the backbeat and the drums aren't keeping the backbeat, that they're playing together, they're all playing the melodies and harmonies in a way that just doesn't sound right. That's what's going on in the brain of somebody with ADHD. And we can now confidently say, based on brain imaging studies, that when somebody gets better when they're treated for ADHD or when they age out of ADHD, as sometimes is the case, that the default mode networks and the task networks tend to become anti-correlated again. Okay? So that's the underlying neurobiology. But you'll notice that I didn't mention dopamine at all. What dopamine is doing in this context is dopamine is acting like a conductor. Dopamine is saying this circuit should be active, then that circuit should be active. It should be default mode network, and then when the default mode network is not active, then it should be the task network. So it's really acting as a conductor saying, you go, now you go, now you go, now you go. And in ADHD, there's something about the dopamine system that is not allowing it to conduct these networks and make sure that they stay what, the engineers or physicists or mathematicians would say out of phase, to be anti-correlated. Okay, out of phase and anti-correlate, essentially the same thing, at least for purposes of this discussion. So that raises two questions. Could it be that dopamine is not at sufficiently high levels? Or could it be that dopamine is just doing it all wrong? In other words, is there no conductor, or is the conductor playing with like little tiny toothpicks, and so the instruments can't see what they're supposed to do? They can't get the instruction because it's just not loud enough, so to speak. Or could it be that the information is getting out, but the information that's getting out is wrong? The conductor is there, but the conductor isn't very good at conducting. Now we can gain insight into how this system works and fails, and how to treat it, by looking at some of the current and previous treatments for ADHD, as well as some of the recreational drugs that people with ADHD tend to pursue and like. Now, I'm certainly not a proponent of people with ADHD taking drugs recreationally. That's not what this is about. But if you look at their drug-seeking behavior and you couple that drug-seeking behavior to their desire to remedy their attention deficit, you start gaining some really interesting insight into how dopamine is regulating these circuits in normal circumstances and in people with ADHD.